Welcome to Authentically, Debz, a podcast about a Southern girl looking at 70. At this time, my mother got very frightened about my situation and my inability to sleep. And she started giving me all sorts of vitamins and then laxatives. And then around that time, I also had to take more enemas that I care to remember. Bless her heart. I mean, I would be doing something and my mother would say, "Debbie, come on. You need to take an enema." Oh my God. She also took me to our family doctor in that little town, and they couldn't find anything wrong with me. Nobody knew what OCD was. I just kind of remained depressed. But ironically, my salvation from this first nervous breakdown, or my first manifestation of OCD, my first bout, happened because of all things, my mother, who was honestly the greatest elementary school teacher I have ever seen in action, albeit in an all-white school, because things weren't integrated at that time. She was suddenly moved from her wonderful fourth grade class, which she was so good at teaching. And having become a teacher, I can look back and just see how good she really was. Elementary is not my cup of tea, but we'll get to that later. But she was phenomenal as a teacher. Anyway, she was suddenly moved from her fourth grade class that she loved to teach middle school, or what was called back then junior high school. And oh my goodness, did she hate it. She was like a fish out of water. She was out of her element. She was not cut out for that age population. And in my opinion, having taught every age of child, middle school age, 6th, 7th, 8th grade is still the most challenging age to teach. And to make things even worse for my mother at that time, the students who were, for the most part, smart asses, whom she might have been able to discipline or learn some strategies to work with, but they were also the sons and daughters, almost every one of them were the sons and daughters of her best friends in that very little town of Haynesville. So my mother was just at a loss of what to do. She never had to deal with discipline problems, and she, in her fourth grade class, and she really didn't know how to do it, and didn't even want to learn how to do it, because these were kids that knew her. These were her best friend's kids. So you would think they would have been respectful to her, but no, not at that age. So my mother was at once going crazy with this. She was sweet. She was delicate. She was fragile. She was a lot like the character of Blanche Dubois. And her obsession was her anxiety over this situation. So she was compulsed. Her compulsion was that she was compelled to find a way out of it. And, thank God it wasn't something like suicide or going completely crazy. But her way out of it was to find another teaching position, even if it meant our having to move to another state to teach in. And she found it when she applied and was offered a teaching job in Stamps, Arkansas. Anything to escape the agony of teaching that junior high classroom of asshole children of her best friends. She just couldn't do it. And although it was another state from Louisiana, it was Arkansas, just north of where we lived. It was in reality only 40 miles away. Now, I live in Los Angeles, and 40 miles away is nothing. Sometimes you drive 40 miles and you're just to the next city, if that. But to my mother and me, it might as well have been in Timbuktu because it was in another state. And the bonus for me was that this move to this little town of Stamps, Arkansas, for some reason, literally snapped me out of my dark depression. My OCD around insomnia. It was over. I was, quote, normal again. And to this day, those 4 very special years that I lived in that tiny little town of Stamps, Arkansas, which, by the way, was even smaller than Haynesville, were the best years of my life, or at least the happiest years of my life that I can remember, really. Now, some might think that's pretty sad, but hey, I'm not dead yet, and I'm finally a girl who wants to have fun. But if I think of something wonderful, I think of those 4 years in Stamps. They're very vivid to me because they were so wonderful in so many ways. I don't know why exactly, but I am going to mention that in our moving to Stamps from Haynesville, we had to drive through another even smaller little town called Hope, Arkansas. And I mentioned this because that was the hometown of Bill Clinton, and he grew up and lived in a small frame house that, of course, now is a national monument. It wasn't at that time. And there's someone else also more famous to me than Bill Clinton, and certainly more grand. And I'm a Clinton fan, although he was far from perfect. Oh my God. But this person I'm referring to now was the late, great Maya Angelou. She was our country's poet laureate, and I know she had a very different experience from mine in Stamps, Arkansas. She was born and raised in Stamps, and she was black, while I was there for just a few years, and I was white. From her books and poems, I can only perhaps understand an ounce of the hell that she had to endure growing up as a black child and a girl, albeit a genius, in Stamps around 1960 at the beginning of the really unending Jim Crow, racially segregated South. It makes me truly ashamed to dwell on the brief happiness I found there. So to be as succinct as possible about the implausible 4 best years of my now long life, even at that young age, the first seminal signs of puberty were felt throughout my child body. I guess I felt a little back at age 8, right? But anyway, in Stamps, I was a big fish in a very small, segregated pond. I was the teacher's kid in an elementary school, and I was a wild thing. What an adventure this 40 miles north move felt like to me in a big way. I was really feeling my oats. And one morning in late summer, school still starts really early down south, the early part of August, I decided to wear short shorts to school. And that year I was going into fourth grade. And I was in the same school building where my mother taught. She was so happy that she found another elementary position, this time fifth grade, but she still loved it because it was elementary, and that was her strength. That's where her magic was. And she truly continued to excel. Anyway, being the straight A student I always was, but also being an overachiever, which I still am, and having OCD, it doesn't get you very far. I was, I guess, being my sassy little self, and really somehow that day, unknowingly, pissed off my fourth grade teacher, who was also a new teacher there. But unlike my mother, she was a young, new teacher to the profession. And she was just getting her bearings. Looking back, her name was Miss Knight. She didn't really know what she was doing as an educator or a teacher. But anyway, getting back to that day at school, she gave me licks. 5 really hard licks with a wooden paddle. Yeah, back in the day, they believed in corporal punishment still. It hurt. And I still don't know what I did exactly to deserve them, but it just made me feel more cool or hip than I already did. I mean, it hurt, but I kind of liked the fact that I could take it. My mother, on the other hand, was very upset about it. But she wasn't upset with me. She was upset with my teacher, Miss Knight. That was my mom. I mean, perhaps she was embarrassed about it. Possibly she might even think her job might be affected by it. But I really think that to her, I could do no wrong. After she and my father divorced when I was a toddler, I truly became my mother's life. I replaced my father for her, and he was the love of her life. As it turned out, that was quite a burden to put on a kid. Going on about living in stamps, when you're telling your life story, you're going along and truly you do have some notes, but then you think of all these other things that you want to remember and say. So please forgive me because this is really hard. I'm telling the truth. And it sometimes seems, it's probably partly my OCD, sometimes it feels it's just too much is coming at me at once with this. But I'm doing my best. So please bear with me and stay with me. As it turned out, although let's see, I must have been 10, maybe 11, I fell madly in love with a boy named Johnny. And looking back, he was a rather puny little blonde white boy who for some reason all the girls found sexy and wanted him. He just had a sexiness about him, and an attractiveness, even at that age. It was very subtle, low-key. He didn't really act like he cared, but boy, everybody wanted him. I mean, all of us little girls wanted him. Johnny was what you might call a serial monogamist, but not really because there was no real sex. And I watched kind of anxiously as Johnny went from girl to girl. Actually, he didn't go anywhere because he didn't do anything. But I knew that he would eventually find his way to me, and then I felt sure that there would be no more girls, just me. And I did have him for my all too brief stay in Stamps. Again, nothing happened, but as was Johnny's MO, one morning he sent one of his friends. Now we're in fourth grade. He sent one of his friends over to me to say, Johnny wants to know if you'll go with him. Well, I was talking to my girlfriends, and I looked at them for a moment, and then I turned to his friend and I said, yeah, I will. And that was that. I had it bad. But although we were going together, again, we didn't go anywhere. In fact, we didn't even acknowledge or speak to each other. But all of his friends and all of my friends knew we were going together. And this continued until I left Stamps in the 7th grade, or I think at the end of the 7th grade. But I just remember wanting him with every cell of my being, and it felt so good. And one thing I do remember was a magical hayride in the last fall season that I lived there. Now, the little town of Stamps, well, everything was rural country. But a friend of mine, I can't remember, I mean, her first name was Becky, but she lived out in the country. I mean, Stamps did have a little town square and all that, but Becky lived out in the country in Stamps, or from Stamps. And her family had a farm, and they had a big flatbed truck, and there were bales of hay that were put in that big flatbed truck. It was just the beginning of fall. It was a cool night, and I was invited to that hayride, and Johnny was invited to the hayride. He also lived in the country, out of Stamps. I remember his father owned a car dealership, and his mother was, a stay-at-home mom. And they went to the same church that my mother and I did. So, I don't know, those were just such magical times for me. But getting back to the hayride, I remember that they helped me and Johnny up into that truck. And I remember we found a place to sit against some bales of hay, and they gave us blankets to cover us up. And we were looking up at the stars in the country, and then the truck started moving, and there were some kids that were on that truck that were by themselves, but mostly it was just little couples like us, little 12-year-olds. And I remember that Johnny put his arm around me, and he kissed me. Actually, I think there was a song back then. And then he kissed me. And that song became very magical to me naturally. It wasn't a French kiss because neither of us knew what that was or how to do it, but it didn't matter. I was in heaven. I guess for me, it's always been the little things in life. So there I was living happily in Stamps. And this is another aside, but something when I was telling you this reminded me of my even earlier elementary years before my first nervous breakdown at age 10, when I was in when I was in Haynesville, and what we would do at recess. At recess, in probably second or maybe even third grade, what we little gang of white girls would do would be to pick out a boy, and we would chase him. And we would chase him to the point that we really drove him crazy. And then at the next day or the next recess, we'd pick another boy and we'd chase him. But we only chased who we thought were the cute boys. But we were just like a little gang of girls chasing a boy. It was just kind of ridiculous when you visualize it. But that's what we did every day at recess. And I remember when I was in first grade, I remember once that I messed my pants. I think it was Maybe I did it twice because I remember it was number 1 and number 2. And I remember that one of my other aunts picked me up. I had to go home, change clothes. It was a big deal. But my first grade teacher, whose name was also Miss Gray, veteran teacher that she was, made sure no one knew about it except me and, of course, my mother, who was in the same building. I also remember that in first grade, I thought it was so cool that I had 5 boyfriends. And let's see, they were Ken, Kenny, Kent, Kenneth. It seems like there were 5, but I can't think. But they all their names started with a K, and I just thought that was just terribly cool. Okay, I'm having a cool time now we're back in stamps. I'm having a great time. And then suddenly at the end of that 7th grade year, my mother got laid off from her teaching job. Now I'm still a teacher, still have that day job of teaching. And I've been through what are called RIFs. That's a reduction in force for teachers, where you think, well, you're sent a letter out in March that says, we won't need your services after June 30th. But then usually those RIFs, most of them are withdrawn and you do get to teach another year. But for my mother, she was truly laid off. And what they did, they went by something called tenure, and the latest people that were hired were the first ones to be laid off. And ironically, the people laid off were 2 teachers, and it was my mother and Miss Knight, the new teacher that had given me the 5 licks. Well, it just so happened that the superintendent of schools for Stamps, small school district, which consisted of only, I think, Stamps and another little town called Louisville, had hired my mother, and he really liked my mother. And at this same time that this teacher layoff thing was going on, he resigned from his position. He resigned from superintendent of schools. I don't really know why he did that, but I think it probably was a little politicking going on. Anyway, who knows? But he knew what a great teacher my mother was, and he asked her if she would be interested in joining him in Little Rock, Arkansas, big city, Arkansas, as one of his teachers, because he was going from superintendent of schools at Stamps, Arkansas, little bitty town, to big Little Rock, being a principal of the Little Rock Air Force Base Elementary School. And I'm sure that somehow that was a promotion. But he asked my mom if she would like to join him, and she liked him so much, and I also knew his daughter who was in my grade, and so she ecstatically accepted. Bottom line, my mother was happy, but I was devastated, leaving Stamps, where I had first discovered my budding sexuality, although leaving there a young virgin, the way I entered, but truly having found the love of my life, Johnny. And I would still call him the love of my life. That's kind of sad. But I think Johnny grew up and married a girl that was a year younger than me, who I kind of saw him going in her direction before I left, but not until I left. And I think he became a mechanic, and they had kids, and I remember her mother. She was pretty, but she was definitely more developed than I was, had bigger boobs and everything. But her mother was really fat, and so it's always been my hope that she would, at this point, be pretty fat too. Anyway, I've never forgotten him, and I've often wanted to go back and see what he looked like, see if he's even still alive, but I never have. I just have that wonderful memory. But I remember that after we did move, I would go back to stamps for visits anytime I could, stay with friends. Let's see, what else? Oh, this is something that is kind of interesting. Like I say, he's the love of my life. I love him. That's never changed. Although I don't even know if he still exists. But I had what I think was a dream, but I still don't know if it was a dream or if it was a reality. And that was that I visited Stamps after I had moved to Little Rock, and I was with Johnny again. And this time we were on a school bus. We were holding hands, as happy as I've ever been in my life. Have you ever experienced something so vivid that you really don't know if it was real or if it was a dream? Well, frankly, who cares? Because happiness trumps everything, even reality. But I was lucky. This was a positive memory, and what an impact it made to this day. But what if a child, especially an African-American child of the same age, had horrible memories of such a place? Well, for most black children, that could have easily scarred them, him or her, for life, because they still did lynchings back then, and just the general discrimination against black people was horrible. And the segregation, the whole Jim Crow shit. But Maya Angelou used all of it. That is her childhood adversity. She used all of it as grist for the mill, which we get from reading I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings and all of her brilliant writing. She was also an actor. But she is a soul to remember, and that is an understatement. There is one more thing I want to mention about Stamps, or that happened in Stamps before I left. I got my first menstrual period in Stamps. I was 12, and I was in 7th grade, and I remember it was the day of a pep rally. And in Stamps, the 7th grade was in the same building as the 12th grade. And I remember I had on my cheerleader outfit, which was black and gold, but the tights were gold. And my mother had never discussed this with me at all. I don't even know if her mother ever mentioned it to her. I don't even know if they had Kotex pads when my mother was that age. And I don't even know when my mother started her period. But there was no mention of it for me, so I was horrified when I went to the bathroom just before the pep rally and saw that my gold tights were completely bloody. Well, I somehow left the bathroom, and this was at the school, and ran into my mother's classroom. This must have been right after school was out. I think I was waiting for my mother in the car and to drive us home, and I had to go to the bathroom, so I went into the elementary school and went to the bathroom. And when I came out and realized what had happened, I rushed into my mother's room and told her, and she must have said something like, "You're having your menstrual cycle." I don't know what she said, but she seemed rather concerned. And she said, "Let's go get Mona and go home." You have to know that Mona was a good friend of mine. Mona was actually brilliant. She came from an alcoholic family and had a turbulent childhood, but both she and her brother became medical doctors. And Mona, at that age, was very motherly to me, and my mother, simply, as wonderful as she was, in no way could handle helping me to navigate my first menstrual cycle. So we went by Mona's house, which was very close to where we lived, a little house we rented on Noel Street. And we picked up Mona, and I guess Mother somehow told her what was going on. And Mona knew all about it because I guess she had already started her period. But I remember I probably on the way home, we bought some Kotex because nobody used tampons back then, at least not little virgin girls like me. So I'm not even sure if they made tampons back then, but it really wasn't 100 years ago. Almost, but not quite. So we had everything we needed. I think we even had safety pins to adhere the pads to my underwear. But we got into my house, and my mother, I guess, in what language she used, I don't know, but she just she just turned the whole thing over to Mona, who was also 12. Mona was also very overweight at that age. I met her years later when we were both adults, and she was actually a doctor in Little Rock, and she came into a retail store that I owned, and I didn't even recognize her, and she told me who she was, and we reminisced. It was wonderful. But at that age, she was very motherly, as I say, a little overweight, probably had to do something to deal with the alcoholic family she was having to live with. And I think by that time her brother had graduated and he was already in college. So it was just her with her nutty parents. And then my nutty mother picking her up to help me with my first menstrual cycle. So Mona did it. I'm not quite sure whether she did it for me, whether she told me to do it. But the point I'm mentioning is that my mother simply could not deal with this. This was just something that she couldn't talk to me about. And when it happened, she couldn't deal with it. So my wonderful friend, my brilliant friend, Mona, did deal with it. And I got through my menstrual cycle. I even thought of starting a blog, which maybe I'll do someday. I don't know. And I'm hoping that when I get to the end of this podcast that I can start interviewing people and see if my crazy life matches up with theirs in any way. But at one point I wanted to do a blog about young women or young girls' first menstrual cycle and what it was like for them. Because it should be a celebration. It should be wonderful. They're becoming women. It should be a rite of passage. Mine wasn't horrible, but it was scary. And that was because of my mother and her inability to help me, and certainly her inability to celebrate it. I saved this wonderful poem by Judith Dirk from Circle of Stones that I'd like to read to you now, real quickly. How might it have been different for you if, on your first menstrual day, your mother had given you a bouquet of flowers and taken you to lunch, and then the two of you had gone to meet your father at the jeweler where your ears were pierced, and your father bought you your very first pair of earrings, and then you went with a few of your friends and your mother's friends to get your first lip coloring, and then you went for the very first time to the women's lodge to learn the wisdom of women. How might you be different? Okay, that's an official goodbye to stamps. Thanks for listening to Authentically, Debz. If you like the show, please check out my website and leave us a review.